Adler's secret, why you feel inferior and how he turned it into power. Why do we feel smaller than others, even when no one is judging us? Why does every achievement seem to vanish the moment we compare ourselves to someone else's success? Behind our silent battles with insecurity, Alfred Adler saw a hidden truth. The feeling of inferiority is not a flaw. It's the starting point of all greatness. Adler, once overshadowed by Freud and dismissed by his peers, discovered something radical. Every human being begins life with a sense of weakness, dependency, and limitation. But instead of condemning it, he called it our greatest motivator. The engine that drives creativity, love, and purpose. The inferiority complex, he argued, becomes destructive only when we deny it or try to mask it with superiority. The moment we accept our smallness, it transforms into the will to grow. This is Adler's forgotten secret, that power does not come from domination, but from contribution, from turning personal inadequacy into empathy and weakness into service. In a world obsessed with proving itself, Adler teaches us a timeless reversal, that our imperfections are not the problem, they are the path. Part 1. The birth of the inferiority complex. Alfred Adler's life began with weakness. Born in 1870 in the outskirts of Vienna, he was a sickly child, frail, asthmatic, often left behind as other children ran freely under the sun. He nearly died of pneumonia at the age of 5, and while lying helpless in bed, he overheard a doctor telling his father that he might not survive the night. That moment marked him forever. In that instant, Adler made a silent promise to life itself. I will not be defeated by weakness. That vow became the foundation of his psychology. Before Adler became the quiet rebel of the Freudian circle, before he coined the term inferiority complex, he lived as a living embodiment of it. His theories were not born in laboratories or textbooks, but in the battlefield of his own childhood, where breath was scarce, energy was fragile, and the will to rise was everything. To him, weakness was not an obstacle to life. It was the origin of life's striving. Adler's childhood was not just physically difficult, it was existentially humiliating. His older brother Sigmund was stronger, quicker, and academically gifted. Teachers praised his brilliance, while Alfred struggled to keep up. In the social hierarchy of the family, he was the lesser child, and that label burned itself into his identity. But instead of succumbing to despair, Adler began to study the hidden logic of inferiority. Why does one person collapse under failure while another transforms it into drive? Why does pain destroy some souls and strengthen others? These questions followed him for life. When Adler later joined Freud's inner circle, he carried these questions into the heart of early psychoanalysis. Freud believed that human behavior was driven by the libido, the instinctual energy seeking pleasure. Adler disagreed. He believed the true motive of life was not pleasure, but striving for superiority. Every human being, he said, is born into weakness, a small creature in a vast world. And from that first helpless cry, we begin the long journey of overcoming. We strive not to dominate others, but to compensate for our inner sense of limitation. But that striving is fragile. If it is guided by courage and empathy, it leads to growth. If it is poisoned by fear and resentment, it turns into neurosis, narcissism, and the endless need to prove. This was Adler's great insight, that the feeling of inferiority is universal, but what we do with it defines our character. Freud saw humanity as driven by hidden instincts, caught in the tension between desire and repression. Adler saw humanity as creative, purposeful, and capable of transforming pain into meaning. For him, the psyche was not a dark machine ruled by unconscious drives, but a living, self-directed system. He called it individual psychology, not because it isolates the person, but because it views each soul as a unique whole, a self-seeking unity moving toward a self-chosen goal. In this light, the inferiority complex is not a disease but a misunderstanding. The child who feels small does not suffer because of weakness itself, but because he interprets it as permanent. He begins to believe he is defective, destined to fail, unworthy of love. That belief becomes the silent law of his inner world. Everything he does, his ambitions, his relationships, his anxieties, begins to orbit that hidden center. He tries to overcompensate, to prove himself superior, but the more he achieves, the emptier he feels. The inferiority complex feeds on denial. It dies only when it is accepted. Adler's vision of humanity emerged from empathy, not analysis. He watched people closely, not their dreams or slips of the tongue, but their posture, their speech, their eyes. He saw how insecurity disguised itself as arrogance, how humility could mask pride, how a boast was often a cry for belonging. To him, every symptom was an adaptation. The shy child avoids attention not because he is modest, but because he fears humiliation. The bully attacks not because he feels strong, but because he feels unseen. Every behavior, no matter how destructive, is an attempt to find significance. Adler called this universal desire the striving for significance. Unlike Freud's libido, it was not biological, but existential. We want to matter. We want to feel that our lives make a difference in the great unfolding of the world. When this striving is blocked, by shame, by comparison, by fear, the soul twists upon itself. It begins to create illusions of superiority, status, and control to protect against the unbearable truth of vulnerability. This, Adler said, is the birth of neurosis, the human being's attempt to escape smallness without accepting it. The tragedy of modern life is that it reinforces this illusion at every turn. From childhood, we are measured, compared, graded, ranked. Our worth is tied to performance. We learn to chase validation instead of meaning, to polish our image instead of developing our being. The inferiority complex becomes institutionalized. The marketplace sells us products not to satisfy desire, but to soothe inadequacy. The social media feed becomes a theater of comparison, an endless hall of mirrors reflecting our secret self-doubt. We scroll not because we care, but because we crave the momentary anesthesia of belonging. Adler would not have been surprised. He saw early on that society, in its pursuit of progress, often breeds psychological insecurity. Civilization tells us to compete, but competition magnifies our weakness. The more we compare, the more we suffer. For Adler, the only antidote to inferiority was social interest, the feeling of being part of something larger than oneself. True superiority, he said, is not domination, but contribution. The person who helps others grows beyond his insecurity because he no longer measures his worth against others. He measures it by his usefulness to life itself. Adler's break from Freud was dramatic and painful. Freud accused him of diluting psychoanalysis with moralism. Adler accused Freud of reducing humanity to instinct. Their split in 1911 was not just intellectual, it was symbolic of two worldviews. Freud saw man as a victim of hidden forces. Adler saw man as a creator of his own destiny. A human being, Adler wrote, is not determined by what happens to him, but by the meaning he gives to what happens. In that single sentence lies the seed of modern existential psychology. To understand the birth of the inferiority complex, Adler turned to the family. Every child, he observed, is born into a hierarchy of power, dependent on parents, compared with siblings, judged by teachers. The feeling of smallness is inevitable, but how a child interprets that smallness depends on love and encouragement. A child who is overprotected learns helplessness. One who is neglected learns hostility. One who is encouraged learns courage. The inferiority complex grows when the child's environment confirms his fears, when every failure is met with criticism, every success with comparison. Adler's genius was to see that even the most destructive behaviors are creative attempts at survival. The child who feels inferior invents strategies to regain self-worth, becoming the overachiever, the perfectionist, the rebel, the comedian. These roles may bring temporary relief, but they harden into masks. Behind the mask, the original fear remains untouched. I am not enough. The paradox is that this very fear, if faced honestly, can become the seed of greatness. Adler himself turned his childhood frailty into empathy. He became a doctor determined to heal others from the very suffering he once endured. He transformed inferiority into service, and that transformation became the foundation of his psychology. The weakling became the teacher of courage. Every person, Adler believed, carries within them both a wound and a task. The wound is the feeling of inferiority. The task is to turn that feeling into creative power. This process is not automatic. It requires awareness. One must look directly at the feeling of inadequacy and ask, what is it trying to tell me? Behind every insecurity hides a wish to grow, to connect, to contribute. The feeling of less than is the soul's way of saying, I am meant for more. Yet modern culture teaches the opposite. We are told to eliminate insecurity, to project confidence, to fake it till we make it. Adler would call this self-deception, the superiority complex, the mirror twin of inferiority. Those who appear most confident are often those who feel most small. The louder the boast, the deeper the fear. True confidence, Adler argued, is quiet. It arises from accepting imperfection. When we no longer need to be better than others, we become free to be ourselves. In this sense, Adler's psychology is a philosophy of liberation. It invites us to redefine strength. Strength is not the absence of weakness, but the ability to transform it. Courage is not the denial of fear, but the willingness to act despite it. The person who accepts his limitations gains power over them. The one who denies them becomes their slave. Part 2, the struggle for power, the hidden architecture of inferiority. If Part 1 was the story of how inferiority is born, Part 2 is the story of how it governs us. It is the invisible architecture beneath our ambitions, the secret motor behind our competition, our social mass, and even our love. Adler called it the striving for superiority, not in the crude sense of dominating others, but as the universal movement of life itself, the wish to rise from what we are toward what we could become. But the tragedy is that in most of us, this striving becomes distorted. It loses its creative direction and turns into the struggle for power. Adler understood something profoundly modern, that human society is built on comparison. From our first report card to our latest social media post, our worth is measured in contrast to others. The self becomes a performance, a project under surveillance. Even love, the most intimate of human experiences, becomes a subtle competition for validation. We no longer ask, am I happy? But am I better? In Adler's view, this craving for superiority masks a deeper truth, the unbearable feeling of smallness. When a person feels insignificant, they compensate by seeking control. The bully controls through aggression, the manipulator through charm, the intellectual through knowledge, the artist through beauty. Power becomes a psychological anesthetic, a way to silence the echoing voice of inadequacy within. But no amount of victory ever satisfies the wound, because the wound itself is not external. Freud believed repression was the root of neurosis, the suppression of instinctual desires. Adler went deeper. He believed discouragement was the root of all suffering. A person loses courage in the face of life's demands, retreats into self-doubt, and begins to construct excuses, fantasies, and masks to protect against further humiliation. Every lie we tell ourselves, every form of self-deception, is an attempt to preserve dignity in the face of discouragement. This is the psychological machinery of inferiority. It hides behind perfectionism, I must prove I'm enough. Behind cynicism, no one is worth believing in anyway. Behind arrogance, I'm better than these people. And behind victimhood, life has conspired against me. Each of these attitudes is a distorted strategy for survival. They keep us alive, but not free. Adler called this the fictional final goal, the imaginary endpoint the psyche invents to give life direction. It could be, I'll be happy once I'm successful, or once I'm loved, I'll be enough. These fictions are not inherently bad. They motivate us. But when we mistake the fiction for truth, we become enslaved to it. We live chasing mirages, never realizing that the desert itself, the inner emptiness, is of our own making. This is where modern psychology meets ancient wisdom. Buddhism teaches that craving arises from ignorance, the failure to see that satisfaction cannot be found in possession. Adler's psychology echoes this in secular terms. The craving for superiority is an endless cycle because it seeks external confirmation for an internal lack. The only true superiority, he said, is moral and creative, the ability to contribute to the common good. Anything else becomes a trap. Consider the modern workplace. Productivity has become a form of virtue, exhaustion a badge of honor. The more we achieve, the more we fear falling behind. Even leisure becomes competitive. Vacations must be Instagrammable. Rest must be optimized. The inferiority complex has metastasized into culture itself, a collective anxiety dressed in ambition. Adler would call this a civilization of discouragement, a world that measures progress by power instead of purpose. The irony, Adler observed, is that the stronger a person's feeling of inferiority, the more desperately they strive for control. This is the paradox of the superiority complex, the need to appear confident precisely because one feels worthless. The dictator, the narcissist, the perfectionist, all are driven by the same engine, a wounded self trying to prove it exists. Power in this sense is a disguise for fear. In therapy, Adler would often ask a deceptively simple question: what would you do if you were not afraid? The answer, he said, reveals the person's true self, the life that lies beyond compensation. A man crippled by inferiority will not admit fear. He will claim, "I don't want to," or "it's not possible." But behind every can't hides an "I fear." Adler's method was not to interpret dreams or analyze symbols, but to uncover the hidden purpose behind the symptom. Every symptom serves a goal, and that goal is to avoid failure. A person who always arrives late, for example, may unconsciously fear judgment. By being late, they protect themselves from having to perform on time. The perfectionist avoids finishing projects to avoid discovering whether they are good enough. The procrastinator delays not out of laziness, but out of terror of inadequacy. These are not random behaviors. They are strategic defenses against inferiority. Adler's insight was radical for its time. Human behavior is not caused by the past, but directed toward the future. We are teleological beings, creatures of purpose. We invent goals, even false ones, to navigate the chaos of existence. The task of therapy and of life itself is to bring those goals into consciousness, to see the fiction for what it is. Once we recognize that our desire for power is a mask for fear, we can begin the real work of transformation, turning the will to control into the will to contribute. But to do that, we must first face the enemy within: discouragement, the feeling that we are too late, too small, too broken to matter. Adler believed that most people are not evil or lazy, they are simply discouraged. Somewhere along the way, they stopped believing that they could make a difference. That is why his psychology was fundamentally optimistic. It did not ask, "What is wrong with you?" but "What are you trying to achieve, and how can you do it better?" Encouragement, in Adler's view, was not just emotional support, it was existential medicine. To encourage someone is to awaken in them the belief that they are capable of facing life. Courage is not the absence of fear, but the decision that something else matters more than fear. When we encourage a child, a partner, or even ourselves, we are reminding the soul that weakness is not destiny. But society rarely offers this kind of encouragement. Instead, it fuels comparison and judgment. The result is what Adler called psychic isolation, the sense of being alone in one's struggle. The discouraged person retreats inward, building walls of cynicism or superiority to hide the pain. But these walls also block connection, and without connection, no real healing can occur. Adler's answer was Gemeinschaftsgefühl, community feeling, or social interest. To heal the inferiority complex, one must shift from self-preoccupation to social contribution. The person who serves others no longer measures their worth by personal success, but by the good they bring to the world. This is the paradoxical cure. The self finds strength precisely when it forgets itself. Modern neuroscience has begun to confirm what Adler intuited a century ago. Studies show that acts of compassion activate reward circuits in the brain, reducing anxiety and increasing resilience. Social connection literally strengthens the neural systems that regulate emotion. In other words, meaning heals. Adler's psychology, once dismissed as moralistic, now appears prophetic. The struggle for power, then, is not to be condemned but understood. It is the soul's misguided attempt to find security in a world that feels overwhelming. The businessman who hoards wealth, the influencer chasing fame, the student terrified of failure, all are seeking the same thing: assurance that they matter. But meaning cannot be borrowed from applause. It must be discovered in service. Adler's message was revolutionary. You are not your weakness. You are what you do with it. The feeling of inferiority will never disappear, nor should it. It is the engine of growth. But when it is poisoned by comparison, it enslaves us. When it is purified by courage and love, it liberates us. Part 3. The courage to be equal. Freedom, meaning, and the transcendence of inferiority. If the first two parts revealed how inferiority is born and how it secretly governs our ambitions, this final part is about liberation. How to transform that old wound into creative power, compassion, and inner freedom. Alfred Adler's entire psychology was built on a single word that few philosophers had ever used with such precision: courage. Not courage as heroism, but as the ordinary daily act of saying yes to life, even when one feels small. For Adler, courage was the antidote to inferiority. It is not about becoming fearless. It is about daring to face fear without running from it or compensating for it. Every human problem, he said, is a problem of courage, the lack of it or the discovery of it. And every neurosis, every addiction, every feeling of powerlessness is an attempt to escape the demands of life by hiding behind excuses. To heal is not to be cured of weakness, but to stand up in spite of it. He called this the courage to be imperfect. It sounds almost trivial until you realize how revolutionary it is in a culture obsessed with perfection. Our education teaches us to compete, our media teaches us to compare, and our technology keeps score of every performance. In such a world, the admission of imperfection feels like failure. Yet Adler saw it as the beginning of authenticity. The moment we allow ourselves to be seen, not as who we should be, but as who we are, we break the tyranny of the inferiority complex. Adler's late work shifted away from analysis of symptoms toward the philosophy of living rightly. He believed that a healthy life rests on three great tasks: work, love, and community. Each of these domains tests the individual's ability to cooperate rather than compete, to give rather than to prove. The person crippled by inferiority approaches work as a stage for validation, love as a mirror for self-esteem, and community as a hierarchy to climb. The person freed from inferiority approaches them as opportunities to contribute, to share one's strength, however small, with the whole. In work, the neurotic asks, "How much am I worth?" The courageous person asks, "How can I be of use?" In love, the insecure soul asks, "Will I be chosen?" The mature soul asks, "Can I give myself fully?" In society, the frightened ask, "Where do I stand?" The free ask, "Where am I needed?" This is the quiet revolution Adler envisioned, a shift from personal significance to social usefulness. It is not humility in the passive sense, but an active participation in the human story. To Adler, maturity was not measured by status or intelligence, but by the capacity for empathy. The more a person can imagine another's perspective, the more human they become. Adler's optimism, however, was not naive. He knew the pull of discouragement never disappears. Even the strongest person feels it in moments of failure or loss. But he insisted that suffering has meaning only when it is faced with responsibility. When pain is turned outward, into resentment or domination, it poisons. When it is turned inward, into self-pity or despair, it paralyzes. But when it is accepted as the cost of growth, it becomes sacred. Here, Adler's psychology meets something close to spirituality. He believed that to live courageously is to cooperate with life's movement toward greater wholeness. This is why he rejected Freud's determinism, the idea that the past dictates the present. For Adler, destiny is created, not inherited. Each of us has the freedom to rewrite our fictional final goal and choose a new direction. Even a person who has failed 1,000 times can decide today to serve a purpose beyond self-defense. But to choose courage, one must abandon the myth of control. Inferiority feeds on comparison. Comparison feeds on illusion. The illusion that life is a competition with others. The illusion that love must be earned. The illusion that worth depends on achievement. Adler urged people to see through these fictions and recognize what he called the equality of souls. In essence, all humans share the same cosmic value. No one is higher or lower, only more or less aware of it. This equality was not political rhetoric for Adler, it was psychological truth. The person who feels inferior, and the one who feels superior are both victims of the same false belief. That value must be measured. Once that belief dissolves, cooperation becomes natural. Compassion is not forced morality. It is what happens when the walls of comparison crumble. Freedom, then, is not the absence of limits, but the acceptance of them. When you stop running from your smallness, you discover that smallness itself is what connects you to everyone else. The courage to be equal is the courage to belong, to be part of the human condition without shame. Adler's legacy, though overshadowed by Freud and Jung, has quietly shaped much of modern psychology. Cognitive behavioral therapy, humanistic psychology, even the growth mindset movement echo his principles: belief in agency, purpose, and the possibility of change. Yet what gives Adler's vision its enduring power is its moral heart. He saw psychology not merely as treatment, but as education for living, a way to awaken conscience, responsibility, and joy. Imagine a world built on Adlerian values. Children encouraged instead of compared, workplaces guided by contribution instead of competition, relationships based on respect rather than control. It would not be a utopia, but a civilization of courage, where inferiority is not denied but transformed into creativity. And it begins always with the individual, with one person daring to say, "I am small and that is enough. I will not hide behind arrogance or despair. I will use what I have, my fear, my wounds, my longing, to serve something larger than myself." This is Adler's forgotten secret, the key he offered to a century still trapped in the cult of success. The cure for inferiority is not superiority, but solidarity. The way out of discouragement is through encouragement, not the hollow kind that flatters, but the kind that reminds us of our shared power to build meaning together. Adler died in 1937, far from home, on a lecture tour in Scotland. He collapsed suddenly, mid-sentence, still teaching, still urging his students to live bravely. There is something poetic in that ending. The man who devoted his life to courage met death doing what he loved most, giving others hope. If he could speak now, to a generation drowning in comparison and digital anxiety, he would likely say the same simple truth he told a century ago. You are not behind. You are not broken. You are only discouraged. Find your courage, and you will find your strength. Because inferiority is not the end of your story. It is the invitation to begin it.